Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 1 of Series 9. The question for today is, can a comprehensive question of human existence be coherently posed? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, read the introduction. So the idea of a question of human existence needs a long introduction that I haven't got time to give here. I'll just say that the question can be coherently posed in terms of consciousness and value, and that my best answer is the affirmation or will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. But as Douglas Adams said, the answer is no use without a question to understand it. So I will begin to outline this question and its context below. And if you think my proposal is audacious, I must ask you for your alternative. Is it happiness, doing God's will, being good, apprehending truth, the will to power, egoism, altruism, contemplation of pure reason, existentialism, the will to will, freedom, or social life? I will simplify or reduce these alternatives and consider them shortly. And I would really like to hear what you have to offer as an alternative. My first reduction is that of all human experience and human existence to consciousness. This approach is endorsed from phenomenologists to the Jungian von Franz and neuroscientist Sam Harris. That is, all human experience must ultimately occur within the boundaries of consciousness, and all human issues must ultimately be resolved in terms of consciousness. Issues like where to live, what to eat, are ultimately human experiences that take place within consciousness. But my point is that basic issues of human existence should be framed and resolved in terms of consciousness. These are issues like meaning, purpose, alienation, enemy, anxiety, self-esteem, and guilt. To understand these issues in terms of consciousness, phenomenology provides a structural perspective. That is, structures like intentionality, temporality, graduation, insubstantiality, and divisibility or unity. But there's a debate here between psychological and phenomenological or structural accounts. Yet this can only be answered by further investigation as carried out in these workshops. However, in favour of both phenomenology and this inquiry, the neglect of consciousness provides an explanation. That is, the neglect of the phenomenon of consciousness also results in a neglect of the question of human existence. And the briefest definitions of mind or consciousness, as below, lead us to the subject of value. John Searle provisionally defines consciousness as all the mental states that we experience. Immanuel Kant posed 3 faculties of mind: equinen, empfinden, and wollen, or cognition, feeling, and will. Analytic philosophy typically reduces this to cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement these classifications with the 4 states of cognition, affect, will, and value. This brings attention to the neglect of value in much philosophical thought, and religion typically has no concept or theory of value. Yet, it is often said that the concept of value is an abstraction without any substantive experiential content. But this is because value is a collective concept which represents different values and value states. Value states is my own term for mental states which necessarily contain values. Some examples of value states are self-esteem, moral fortitude, and meaning or purpose. You should be able to find your own examples of values, but these conceptions are essential to understand what I'm saying here. Yet to clarify, I must add that cognition, affect, will, and even consciousness are also collective concepts. That is, there is no pure consciousness. It is an amalgam and an integrative concept of particular mental states. That is, states like cognition, affect, will, and value. But challenging this neglect, value is ubiquitous in life, with many crucial functions that have been overlooked. In religion, for example, God is the believer's highest value, together with numerous other values. Ethical principles are values that guide moral action. A meaningful life is also a worthwhile and a valuable life. David Easton described politics as the authoritative allocation of values, and economics is the quantification of material values into monetary tokens. And despite the widespread significance of value, it has long been neglected, even going back to ancient times. Cruden's major biblical concordance, for example, records only 10 instances of the word, and only as an adjective or verb. As for ancient Greece, Marx tells us that Aristotle had no concept of value, but he may have overstated the point. But Aristotle neglects the Kantian moral features of goodwill and the value of people as ends in themselves, and neither the fact value or the is or distinctions were familiar in ancient Greece. Moving forward to 1776, Etienne Bonnot was the first economist not to agree with the objective or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. Hume's discovery of the is-ought distinction also came late and is still often overlooked today. And in the 19th century, science was regarded as objective and value-free, and now it's seen as value-laden. Auguste Comte likewise had advocated a positivist and value-free sociology as a form of social physics. This was followed by Rudolf Carnap and logical positivism. And on this view, value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. Summing this up and bringing us up to the present, Charles Gray Shaw wrote in the early 20th century, I quote, "Value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy." My point is that the neglect of value means that something has probably been overlooked. And in my view, what has been overlooked is value as a principle of life. Before giving a brief explanation why value is a viable principle of life, there's no time for detailed argument, we should look at why three other states of cognition, affect and will don't provide viable principles of life. I take it that this classification is comprehensive and describes consciousness exhaustively. The viability of cognitive states in explanations of motivation, morals, and meaning is debated in analytic philosophy. One argument is that non-cognitive theories are said to be blind and unable to guide action. Yet cognitive theories are said to be impotent and unable to motivate action or morals. Hume represents the non-cognitivist view, which seeks explanations primarily in terms of affect and feeling, and cognitivists like Kant explain morals and motivation primarily in terms of reason and certain conceptions of things. An illustrative question here is, do we eat an apple because we desire it or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively compelling, and issues of meaning and purpose also seem to need some resolution in terms of non-cognitive experience. It's difficult to see how a bare conception of things can satisfy issues of meaning and purpose. Yet ethical questions seem to be more complex and difficult to resolve. If cognition doesn't provide an adequate principle, affect states are a common non-cognitive alternative. Affect states are emotions and feelings like pleasure and happiness, as well as negative states like pain and disgust. Happiness also figures in utilitarianism in its central principle of utility. And a social policy, maximum happiness for the maximum number of people, is difficult to dispute. But as a theory of ethics, it has serious inadequacies of justification and motivation. And happiness cannot answer questions of meaning, purpose, or the why of life. Like other states, the significance of the will depends on its function and how it is used and qualified. The will or volition is a variable state, ranging from Nietzsche's will to power to Kant's goodwill. And as a further feature, the ingredient required to motivate action can be described as the will. But the will is a process or a vehicle embodied in action or a habit of thought applied in different circumstances. The will can't then be constitutive of a state or an objective itself. And as such, the will isn't a viable candidate as an explanatory human objective. Yet it might be a mistake to look for one kind of state because a principle of life might need multiple states. Nor might we be able to argue states against each other, as they seem to overlap across a spectrum. Nietzsche, for example, proposed a justification by aesthetic value that involved affective experience. Hilary Putnam presented an entanglement as the collapse of the fact-valued dichotomy, and existentialists and others have described value as volitional. Yet this doesn't prevent us from considering each of these states in turn, or one of them, like value, as primary. In fact, we should consider them in combination, as I finally do, in the idea of an ongoing dialectic. And in this way, these four states are the building blocks of more complex positions. But if the explanative power of cognition, affect, will and value does turn out to be insufficient, we would have to consider the significance of consciousness itself as a human objective. But consciousness, or its increase, isn't a viable solution as an objective in itself. This is the case for at least the three following reasons. 1. Consciousness itself doesn't specify or contain the particular properties that may provide a resolution. 2. It incurs problems like anxiety, anomie, fragmentation, alienation, guilt, and awareness of finitude. And 3. Structures like temporality, divisibility, and graduation render consciousness intrinsically problematic. Yet it's these structures of consciousness that also enable us to explain value and its origins. And in my view, the combined structural problems of consciousness can be described as insubstantiality. This is because temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility, and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts, and alienation. And graduation means that we not only develop but also diminish and eventually die. Sartre opposes the insubstantiality of consciousness in relation to the independence and permanence of physicality. But I propose a more realistic response as a sufficiency of value, not a sufficiency of physical features. Yet there are at least two aspects of my argument here about value as a principle of life that are positive and negative. The negative aspect of my argument is about the inadequacy of other foundations for a principle of value. The positive aspect is about the adequacy or even the inescapability of value as a principle. Positive arguments for value include its priority, self-valuation, and sufficiency. Yet we can begin these arguments by discussing the status of value as a constituent of consciousness. Consciousness is significant because it also has the status of one of the fundamental modes of existence in the world. Consciousness isn't just a contingent entity like a particular species of fauna or flora. It is both the essentialia of human existence and a fundamental aspect of all existence. Yet even this kind of significance of consciousness as human existence or as a mode of being isn't enough. The kind of significance that we ultimately need isn't due to the status of consciousness in the world, nor is it due to the significance of theories of consciousness in explaining human activity. It is due to the subjective significance that we can attribute to these elements as experiences in our lives. For that, we must look to value as both a legislature of significance and as a constituent of consciousness. But before discussing that, we need to say more about consciousness as an integrative concept. The significance of both consciousness and value can be seen in their mutual relation and coexistence. To show this, I take an argument from Sartre that the being of the self as consciousness is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. Sartre builds on the idea of contrast, choice, and selection as constituents of both value and consciousness. He holds choice as just not a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, unquote. And elimination and selection are expressing the values of disfavour and approval or preference. Sartre wants to trace selection to its ontological foundation, but he doesn't do this explicitly. But we can explain and extend the notions of choice and selection with the idea of contrast. Monotone is inimical. Monotone is inimical to selection, choice, value, perception, and indeed to consciousness. That is, these capacities need contrast, like the earlier noted black spot on a white board. We can say then that every perception entails contrast, selection, and value. We look one way and make a selection and preference that produces an antithesis or negation. And we can then say that value is ubiquitous in every aspect of our conscious lives, and that value and consciousness are coexistent. But at least two objections can be made to this kind of explanation of incipient values. One, values also emerge from social and biological sources without such selection or choice. But sociology or biologically or sociologically or biologically derived values aren't deliberated or chosen and thereby not justified. Also, an automatic propensity to action aren't values, are only latent or potential values. They only become moral values on selection as preferences and as mental states. And two, they are not the values we need in motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. But the above are just nascent values, and that is to be expected when explaining the origins of value. And further accounts of consciousness have the potential to explain more substantive values. Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer such an account of time that provides more substantial values. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through diversity in space. And substantial values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. But there's another problem of justification and priority of value and values, as well as of cognition and effect. That is, why give priority to value over states like knowledge or happiness in a philosophy of life? It's because value is arguably paramount in theories of ethics, meaning and purpose. And value states provide the appropriate satisfactions for morals, meaning and purpose. Also, to establish priority of value, constraints such as posed by Hume and Moore can become guiding principles. Hume's law or principle is that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be derived from a factual is. So values can have a justification and priority over facts or psychological states. Yet there's another problem of why are values justified in the first place, and how can they continue to be justified? To resolve this problem, instead of beginning with facts, as usual in academic discussions, we have to start with values as demonstrated above, with the coexistence of value and consciousness. But this still does not provide an initial or ongoing justification of value and values. To resolve this problem, I want to refer to the prescriptive principle of value in the form of the will to value. And this principle is justified by the fact that not to value value is contradictory, regressive, and self-negating. Robert Nozick speaks of valuing values. I'm talking about valuing value as a general principle. And the will to value expresses the ability of reflective consciousness to affirm or deny value. As a fundamental aspect of consciousness, the valuing of value, or the will to value, is expressed in innumerable ways. For example, the will to value is expressed in positive value states such as courage, love, or Nietzsche's amorphous. Yet Sartre's concept of a spirit of seriousness illustrates two ways of failing to value value. The spirit of seriousness is to misrepresent subjective values as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. The classic example is to say in bad faith that I have no choice. This makes a supposed error of taking the idea of I have no choice as an objective fact or value. This is a failure to value value because it is a refusal to choose, and choice is an intrinsic property of value, and not to choose is a negation of value. It is also a failure to value value because it is valuing an object or principle which has no value in itself. That is, arguably, only people as self-conscious beings and mental states are candidates of intrinsic value. On this view, principles or objects only have instrumental value attributed to them by people. So to take principles or objects as having intrinsic value contradicts the will to value. Yet another kind of justification can be found in the idea of self-validation. Self-validation of values or morals has been proposed by Nietzsche, Williams, Dworkin, and others. Self-validating principles are used to justify logic and mathematics, but not thought possible in physics or ethics. Logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's four basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. A self-validating system within the human sphere might be Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Mathematics and logic are self-validating, but they can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. But I propose that the will to value is self-validating because the alternative is contradictory and self-negating, and systems of value need a self-validating principle due to the problems such as posed by Hume. I've just noted two reasons why not to value value is contradictory, self-negating, and self-defeating. One, a failure to value value is found in a refusal to choose, which is a fundamental property of value. And two, valuing objects or principles as intrinsic value as is regressive, contradictory, and simply erroneous. that is, not to value value, is also a negation of the principle of value that drives and culminates all conscious existence. But this presupposes the principle of the will to value that I've been arguing for implicitly in this paper. That is, the structures of consciousness and value constrain and direct our choices towards valuing. A related example of such constraint is Sartre's idea that we are condemned to choose, condemned to be free. Another is Heidegger's and Sartre's above account of time that reveals the inescapability of value. But the question could be posed, what does the will to value lead to or amount to? Firstly, it need not lead to anything. It could be its own reward as a value or as a valid theory. But I hold that the will to value or the value of value results in a certain sufficiency of value. That is, the will to value evokes the kinds of value that enjoy a sufficiency of value. Sufficiencies of value are value states like self-esteem, dignity, courage, patience, and magnanimity. Yet, of course, human finitude means that sufficiencies are always insufficient and are works in progress. And value sufficiency has a certain independence of experience comparable to happiness and pleasure. I previously explained the sufficiency of value in detail, but I can make a couple of comparisons here. Firstly, the idea of God is a historical development of the believer's highest value, characterized by sufficiency. And Aristotle's eudaimonia is the supreme good, which he also qualifies as self-sufficient. And as the supreme good, it is a moral concept which can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. My point is about value sufficiency as an objective in both theory of value and in human experience. I noted ethical principles as values that guide our actions, and ethical fortitude expresses resilient value. A meaningful life is also a valuable and worthwhile life that is sufficient to confront loss and adversity. These examples indicate that the notion of value sufficiency would not be viable as a maximization of value. Value sufficiency can't be a matter of quantification, but of quality and appreciation of absence and of the other. And of course, human finitude means that sufficiencies of value are always insufficient and are works in progress. Human beings are absolute spirits with sufficient value, able to confront every contingency. People need supportive ideas like religious belief, political ideals, personal support, and ideologies. And religion can be usefully cited as a paradigm example of a supporting cognitive framework. Belief in God, doctrine, and church structures provide the cognitive support that experience needs. Social esteem and other people's regard is another huge part of a supporting cognitive framework. My usual example is of a 5-year-old who needs parental approval not required by a 25-year-old. Yet both the examples of a child and of religion show we are dealing with a process of development. And in that development, we can see a preference for an independence and a sufficiency of value. As noted here and elsewhere, values, human action, and experience are entangled with supporting cognitive frameworks. And it is always the case that value and value sufficiency is in a dialectical relation with cognitive structures. Yet value sufficiency is driven by the principle of value seeking further value to value value as the will to value. In this dialectic, value seeks independence from cognitive support, which produces further value. And this value again needs support, which again seeks further value. This is the dialectic between the relative sufficiency of value states and supporting cognitive frameworks. Yet the relative sufficiency of value is a sufficiency expressed in such ways as moral fortitude and self-esteem. In this way, the theoretical principle of the will to value is also a principle in life and in life experience. I conclude with the principles of the will to value and the sufficiency of value in answer to the question of human existence, and that these follow from structures of consciousness different from Kant's and Hume's theories of mind. These were not able to adequately resolve problems of priority and justification of value. But values derived from structures of consciousness already contain certain values and volitions, and these inescapably direct value by means of authentic choice and an affirmation or the will to value. Yet the story of these principles doesn't begin in theories of ethics or other such human activities. It begins with the obfuscation, neglect, and realization of the significance of consciousness, and we noted particular problems in apprehending both consciousness and value. Yet we found that an analysis of consciousness in terms of cognition, affect, will and value results in comparisons and contrasts of these states that leads to value as the salient state in this inquiry. Yet as a state of consciousness, the significance of value was enhanced, not just as a fundamental aspect of the world, but also in its relations to selections, choice and preference as fundamental aspects of consciousness. This led to a form of validation in which not to value value is contradictory and self-defeating. The unexpected consequence for life, meaning and human purpose is the discovery of a principle in terms of value. That is, long-standing values like ethical fortitude and independence from social endorsement find a new basis, and that a guiding principle can be produced from the subjective structures of consciousness. I will be working through such aspects of consciousness in forthcoming workshops. The kind of response to this work that I'm looking for is either a recognition of how a clarification might have been made of the enigma of human existence, or as well as refutations and criticisms showing how I have been mistaken. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.